ever since the death of George Floyd, and I can't, again, I can't say enough about how tragic that entire situation was, and sadly how easily it played into the agenda of a certain group of political affiliates who used it to further divide a country that was already being divided and had been massively split apart by the responses to COVID-19. But ever since that time, once the death made news the day after it happened, and the riots began almost immediately, we started to see a shift in a certain practice, and that practice was of law enforcement personnel being able to publicly speak out while in uniform about current events. And the reason I bring that up is several days after some of this started to go on, there was an individual in law enforcement who was fired from his job because, and I would say to some degree rightly so, because he made some very political statements while in uniform, while in his squad car, parked, filming a video about everything that was going on. And he spoke out against the protests and the riots, and he spoke out against in a powerful way, and what he said was dead on. It was right, it was accurate, but he because he did it while in uniform and therefore ostensibly representing the agency that he worked for, he was reprimanded and then he was let go. And this has happened in numerous ways throughout the United States, and I can't give you an exact count, but there have been several people who have been fired from their positions within law enforcement for doing this very thing, speaking out against, while in uniform, against the riots, against the Black Lives Matter movement. Not against the same Black Lives Matter, but against the organization and the movement because of its innately, intrinsically Marxist roots and ideology. And it's unavoidable, and I will be doing everything I can to put as many links as possible in the description of this video to point you to the Marxist sources as they're quoted for the Black Lives Matter movement and organization. The leaders and the founders of the organization have flat out admitted they are Marxists, and they're proud of it, and that's their goal, is to foster Marxism, which is why they've embraced so many aberrant beliefs. And when I say aberrant, I'm not speaking from just a religious background, but from a societal background. They've just embraced a lot of aberrant beliefs. Marxism and its affiliates are all aberrant. It is not healthy. It's dangerous. Classical liberalism is not bad. I have many classically liberal friends. We share some views alike, and others we don't. But classical liberalism is fine. It is leftism and progressivism and Marxism that are incredibly dangerous. And that's a Black Lives Matter movement. That is Antifa. And these things are all interlinked. And so an officer should be very careful in how he speaks. Anybody in law enforcement should be careful how they speak while they're in uniform, while they are on duty. Their political beliefs and even their religious beliefs do not have to be completely ignored and forgotten. And it really, nobody's beliefs can be completely separated from who they are when they're on duty or on the job. There's just no way to avoid that. You filter everything through a lens. And yet, when you're hired to do a job, and I'm going somewhere with this, trust me, when you're hired to do a job, it's your responsibility to really do that job and approached every single person in a matter of neutrality. I don't care what your job is. If you're a clerk at a bank, if you are a cashier in a convenience store, if you're a stock boy or girl or stock individual in a grocery store or a retail establishment, you approach your job with a sense of neutrality in how you approach things and how you approach customers or people that you're serving. And that should be the case with law enforcement. Now, the other side of the coin of this is, as some people were being reprimanded and others being fired for taking a counter view to the prevailing winds of society, to countering the cultural revolution that we see happening around us in this culture war, in this socio-political Marxist revolution against the Republic of the United States, as these people are losing their jobs or being reprimanded or being threatened with the loss of their careers, other officers were doing things like laying down, putting their hands behind their backs, and apologizing for being white while in uniform. Yes, that happened. An officer was shot in video, not shot, was shown in video. Video was shot of him doing this, laying down in front of protesters, putting his hands behind his back and apologizing for being white, apologizing for white violence perpetrated by white police, and asking them what more he could do, and the response was, "You should die." That officer, as far as I know, was never reprimanded. There are stills and videos of officers of every ethnicity kneeling in solidarity with protesters, putting their hands up in the air in what's now become the power symbol of the Black Lives Matter movement, which they adopted from the Black Panthers. By the way, the Black Panthers were a radical Marxist organization. That's indisputable. You can't know history and not know that. There have been officers who have stood and watched as protests go on and lifted their arms in the Black Power salute as rioters and protesters go by and film them in uniform. No reprimands. No loss of job. And I personally believe that anybody, you're free to your beliefs. The First Amendment protects that. What the First Amendment doesn't protect is you in the practice of your duties, there again, no matter what your job is, but you in the practice of your duties, violating what I know to be a very common policy of every agency, of almost every agency in the United States, where you come out and make a political, socio-political statement in uniform as a representative of the agency or organization that you work for. What's not right is the lack of equality in this, not equity. Well, you know what? Oh, really, it should be equitable. If you're not going to fire one for doing one thing, then you shouldn't be firing the other for doing the other thing. So here's what's happening too, and one of the pretty common outcomes of all of this, and this has been going on since Ferguson protests, when Darren Wilson rightfully, lawfully, and legally took the life of Mike Brown, who was trying to kill him. The protests erupted, and Black Lives Matter swooped in, turned it into violence and whatnot, and then other groups, organizations, and individuals took it upon themselves to go around and start, if you will, policing social media, looking for people in law enforcement saying things that they felt were inflammatory or wrong, and trying to get officers fired for what they said on their own time, on their own dime, not affiliated in any way with who they work for. And so I've actually been contacted by several people, several people over the last several months saying, man, you don't know what kind of pressure we're under right now. And I'm like, well, can you explain to me what you mean? And that pressure is, we're being talked to. We're being told, you better not speak out on this. Like, I know of one individual who was literally told that if you say anything about this publicly, your job here is done. And I said, so clarify. They mean if you identify with your employer, and that person was told, no, not just identifying their employer as an employee of or a official of this particular agency, if you speak out about this at all, and it comes to our attention, you will be dismissed. And when this individual asked, why is that? They were told by a person in leadership, right now, anything that we say that is not completely neutral or in favor of the things that are happening will lead to unrest. And anybody who's affiliated with this agency is under a strict gag, because we cannot have it seen or perceived that we endorse speaking out against such things as the Black Lives Matter organization or even Antifa, because they have the control of society right now, and they will ruin us if we don't remain silent. That should terrify you. That should upset every red-blooded American right now. That people on their own time, who are not saying anything hateful, who are not advocating violence against, who are not advocating violence in any way, who are not advocating any kind of harm be done, but are simply speaking out and pointing out how what's happening is wrong, how it's actually ethnicism, how it's actually racism. Anybody who speaks out, anybody who points out the criminal activities of rioters, whether they be Black Lives Matter organization or Antifa or any of those groups that are all affiliated, consider what's happening in Oregon and has been happening in Oregon since the beginning of all of this. If you speak out against any of these things and people come after you, you'll lose your job. If they point it out, you'll lose your job. If we find out, you'll lose your job, because we can't afford to have to deal with that right now. That's wrong. And so this is for anybody who sees this. If you're in law enforcement, if you are in any kind of public service, if you're in any kind of position of any job, yes, you work at the discretion of your employer, absolutely. I think there are certain protections that are in place for most of us in whatever career field we're in. But if you speak out, or if you've been told, do not comment on this on your own, even on your own time. If your employer in any way, shape, or form, no matter who it is, has told you that they don't want to find out about it, or they don't want to hear that you've been speaking out, I want you to contact me, either here on this channel or through the Facebook page. I want you to contact me. We need to form support for people. We have freedom in the United States. Now, we have consequences for actions that we take. There are responsibilities with freedoms. I don't deny that. But your livelihood, your income, your source of maintaining the life that you built for yourself should not be threatened if you are not doing illegal activities. Period. The people who should be in danger are the people who are doing things that are illegal. The people who are in danger are the people who are violating the policy and procedures of their employers. So if you're going to fire one person for doing one thing, but you don't fire the other person for doing the exact opposite of what that person is doing, or doing the exact same thing that that person is doing, but in favor of the current societal trend, you violated that person's rights, their freedoms. And while the Constitution and the First Amendment and all of the amendments ultimately apply to government, there are certain rights that are afforded to us by our very nature as human beings that your employers cannot strip from you. And they cannot use those things to target you and remove you from employ. They can't. And people have fought for these things, and they have won. They've won judgments, they've won settlements against employers. But right now everybody's terrified, and that should stop. Take a stand. Be careful in how you say things. Be mindful of what you say, but do not be too afraid to speak out. And if you have been warned, if you have been counseled, if you have been cautioned, if you've been told if you don't stop, if you've been told don't do this, you're going to lose your job, reach out to me. Let's build a network of people who are willing to watch out for one another. It's not right. We shouldn't be canceled from our employers. We shouldn't be canceled from our livelihood just because we're pointing out where things are wrong or why things aren't right. Speak out. Be bold and be public. And when you're approached, let people know. As always, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for being open-minded. Thanks for listening. I would ask that over here in the corner, somewhere on your screen, you hit the subscribe button. It's important, not for me, but because mainstream media, legacy media, isn't going to get the word out. They're not going to let people who don't toe the established line speak. So for the sake of liberty and for the sake of the defense of this nation, small little independent voices like mine need to be heard, especially the interviews. It's got very little to do with my commentary and a lot more to do with the interviews and the people who are affected when liberties are tread on. So once again, hit the subscribe button, like, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much.